Hello and welcome to the tutorial and promo video for the movement and rotation tool we've recently built. This is a simple little tool used for moving items around in 2D and 3D space. One of the biggest reasons behind why I wanted this program built was that when I was working in a 3D space, I wanted to rotate an item, but I couldn't rotate it because you can't rotate items in a 3D space. And so I decided I would make a tool like this so that you can do that. And in fact, you can do a bit more than that. So let's go ahead and see some situations it can deal with. First off, actually, let's go over a few of the things that I've got in the program notes here. Basically, the limitations of the program currently are that it doesn't work with linked elements. Linked elements are a little bit complicated, and also I don't think that you can usually adjust linked elements inside of other programs, so it's probably best not to mess with those. So linked elements aren't allowed. For pivot points, you must pick a point on the solid of a model. In fact, I find that you mispick the vertex points. So we want to expand this in the future, but that's currently what we have to work with. Also, as a note, if you pick the center points of an object, they won't work either. That we hope to improve in the future, but currently it's not accessible. And we'll give an example of this later on. And we also say that you shouldn't use this on dimensions, although you technically can, you really shouldn't. And we'll give an example of that as well in the later examples. Some things to know for this program. There could be issues with walls and detail lines. They tend to connect automatically. We'll see an example of that in the future. Elements that cannot find a proper location information will be removed from the selection. It's very rare and probably unlikely, but it will remove them because the program can't figure out what to do with them at all because they have no location information. And this is weird, but it's kind of due to how the way Autodesk works with this stuff. There's a few different methods for it, so it's complicated. Just know that we tried to put in as many as we could, and it should work for like 99% of all cases. There might be a few though. Some items like section views only have bounding boxes for location. This can be inaccurate on rotations, only very slightly, but in such a way that if you rotated it to the left and then back, it would be slightly to the left or right or whatever. It would move slightly, is the point. However, if you were just moving it with a horizontal or vertical movement, that should be correct. There's no reason for that to be wrong, but play it safe and probably try not to have bounding box items. Once again, there shouldn't be too many situations like this, and our program will alert you if you're using a selection set that has it included, and it'll ask you if you want to remove it or not. We'll show an example of that in the upcoming examples as well. And it is often best to use this program on straight parts, or it's often best to put your pivot point on straight parts because they have the most options available for them. And we'll see what I mean by that soon. Let's show some of the core features of this program, which are to move and rotate items within your project. Right now we can test this out on this element here, this little piece of duct. Let's go for 10, 10. It's usually a pretty good base for doing things. You can do radians and degrees, whichever you want to put in, and inches, feet, millimeters, all that. Any metric sizing you need, you can put in here, and it will be that number. So if you have like 10 millimeters you want to move something by, or 100 millimeters, you can do that. If you want to use inches, you can use inches in a millimeter project. It will convert it to what it needs to use. Everything will work pretty smoothly. So in this instance, we want to select an item. We'll select our duct here. Let me also make sure this is on screen for the most part. We want to select our duct there. We want to go ahead and we have a auto set pivot on single select checked on. This is by default. Whenever you select an item by itself, like a single item selection, it will automatically set a pivot element as well to that element. Now you could select this as a pivot element or that as a pivot element and choose to move the other item according to this pivot element. So if I set this pivot and that not pivot, or as this the element I want to move, then it will pivot around this element. For move, that's not important. It doesn't do anything for a move since everything will move left or right with each other. It doesn't really do anything. It's mostly for rotations. So in this instance, we've selected this duct. It's automatically been set to the pivot element, and you can see here single mode selection. The pivot element is this ID, the element. There's no pivot point because we're not doing a pivot point rotation, but we will show a pivot point in a bit. And in this instance, we want to just move this around a bit to show the accuracy of this program, and that you can move it 10 millimeters to the left or right, up or down. You can change that however you want. Let's go by 100 now. See, no problem. In any view that you put your camera in, the left will move it to the left, the right will move it to the right. These arrows will move according to what your camera is facing. So long as our camera is facing down, from top down, this is left, this is right, this is up, this is down, or north, east, south, west, however you want to do that. And the pitch, the in and pitch down / out pitch up, this is towards the camera or away from the camera. So if I did in, that would raise this duct some amount of distance. So if I move this up like a few hundred, or I move it down a few hundred, it won't look like it's moved from a 3D perspective. I pull up a 3D perspective. I have one of this area. Look from here. Zoom in. So if we see the duct there, if I move that up, so pitch in, we'll move it towards the camera, or in, we'll move it towards the camera. Move it like 300, should go up 300. In fact, I should be able to get it to go through the floor there. If I move it up enough, make it a bit larger. Move it up a few more. And as you can see, it's getting higher. I want to get it to go through the ceiling, but it's a bit hard to tell. There you go. Now it's in the upper floor. And we can move it back down and put it back to where we wanted it to be originally, which is like right about there. And you can do this with any element that you select to move them around. We can do a rotation. Let's do it on this one so that we don't mess up our dimensions here, because they will not like us rotating it so much. We'll set it to rotation, and we'll be rotating it by 10 degrees. So we will do a pitch up. So what pitch up is going to do, based on our pivot point being set to the center of the element and the center of the picked pivot element. So this is the picked element, which also happens to be the pivot element because of our auto set. But we could have set that manually. Because this is the picked pivot element, this is the one where we will be getting the center point from. Since it's set to center, it will center it at the exact center of this part. And if we do a pitch up, which is this button here, it will rotate so that this end goes to the north and this end goes to the south. So we pitch it up, pitch it down, go further down, back up. We can do a roll. We can roll backwards, and we can yaw. And from different perspectives, that changes the name of that, but that is how it will work in every view from the camera direction. So if we were on an elevation view, let's say we could do it actually in this case. So let's go here. We'll go to the front view to see it head on. It's a little bit low. Let's move it up some. so I can actually see it. Actually, might not want to move too high up so I can keep it on the view over there. And if we set it to rotation, let's have it pitch up, and as you'll notice, it's doing the same direction as it did in the other view. However, this would now be an actual pitch from the perspective of the program, and this would, in our case, be a yaw from this camera angle. So you don't have to worry about those names for rotations and all of that. You just use the program and remember that from your camera, these arrows are connected to that camera. And just with that information, you should be able to quickly make your decisions if you want to do a few rolls, or pitch it down some, pitch up, whatever you want to do. You can undo it, redo it, whatever you want to do. And you can do that in any view, and you can do it on the fly without too much effort. And so we would want to do a roll here, so we just do pitch. If we wanted to do a pitch from that other view that we were just in, just do a roll here. And you can do this from any angle, including multiple angled, or maybe even completely random, depending on how you want to do it. Do remember, though, since it's using the camera view, if you are not at an exact 45 degree, you might end up with some complicated numbers. So let's say that your camera is at a weird angle, something like a 10 degree angle off of something. When you do a rotation along like the right side, you will be offset in a way by 10 degrees. So I'm trying to think of a better way to say this. If your angle from your camera is really weird and you're trying to do a 90 degree up, but your camera is not placed at an exact front or right or top view, and you do a 90 degree angle, it might be 80% front and 20% right, or something along that line. So you know what I mean? Where you have a fractional rotation rather than what you were wanting to do. So you're not going to get that full 90 because it's not a cardinal direction, such as north, south, east, west. If I do this 50-50 one and I do a 90, it's going to go up in two different axes. So do be very careful if you're doing something like that. There are features in this program that allow you to do things that prevent you from doing something like that. So let's say we can show off our view locking a little bit here. If you have a view that you're in, like a 3D view, but you don't want to change your position to be a front view or anything of the sort, you can set the front view in a way using the view locking system. So this cube represents the direction of your camera. You are at the center looking out at these buttons. So if you want a north view, a front view, so where you're in the center of this cube looking to the north, which would be the same as being on the front view in this cube, you would set north, and that will lock the view direction to north. And so now if I do a 10 degree pitch up, it will do it just as it would have no matter what angle I'm at. Even if I'm at a skewed angle, which would cause like a disaster in any other situation, it is now a clean rotation along the north face. So you can set your view lock to control that if you want to have a different perspective of your object in a 3D view while you're changing it by a controlled direction, such as a 90 degree. If I wanted to do a 90 degree tilt up, it's 90 degrees here no matter what I do. Even if I'm at this angle and I do the same button, it's doing the same move it would have done in that perspective. So you can use that if you ever need to control the view angle artificially. Otherwise, you just clear direction and it'll set it back to none, and now it'll be using the right one. So if I do it again, that will now rotate in a different way because this view has set that rotation direction. So keep that in mind, but that's what's really powerful about this, is that you can, in any view, control what angle you want to rotate something. I could even sit in this view and say that I want to rotate it 90 degrees using this button. You can technically use any of these buttons, so it may not make as much sense to use it in those situations, but let's say I want to tilt this upward by 90 degrees, but not in this way. I want to tilt it upward towards the camera. Well, I can just set it to locked north and hit upward, and now it's facing the camera. So it's something simple you can do if you're ever in a situation where you want to just cleanly, quickly change the direction of a piece of duct or something like that. It also has the ability to point directly north, or not directly north, directly up towards the camera. So if you want a top-down view, no matter what view you're in, you can use bottom, and you can lock it to the down direction, but we're not going to really worry about that because it's not necessary for us to do that. We're already in the top-down view. So let's say we don't want to use the dead center of this part. Let's say we want to use the front end or the back end. Well, for any straight parts, there's a likelihood that they have a beginning and end point as well. In those events, if it's a straight, usually, you can do this, where you select the 0. Sorry, let me get this on camera again. Where you can hit the 0, and you can have that rotate along the front end piece, or you can hit the 1 and have it rotate along the back end piece. This will change based on the orientation of the duct. So if the duct was drawn in that direction, 0 would be on this side and 1 would be on this side. You can quickly figure this out with a quick test of a little rotation. So let's say that I want to rotate it upward from this point. It's selected point 0, and I do pitch up. So now it's rotating from that pivot point. Or I can have it set to the center, rotate along the center, or I can have it from the end and rotate downward because it's going to move the right side upward. So that's what you can do with the pivot points. You can also do center of group. Now center of group is always from the actual center. So this will only be center all the time. However, the center of group means if I select a lot of the stuff in this room, the center point would be here. So if I did that and did a rotation on these elements, it would rotate all of these elements, let's say 10 degrees, and this would be the point that they pivoted around right here. But we also have something called select pivot point. So let's say we select a pivot point on this duct. So we can hit pivot point. We select the element we're going to get the pivot point on. You are not able to use these endpoints currently, as they are center points, they're midpoints for this line. We hope to add this in the future, but currently you cannot use that. There's also no middle points here, sadly, so we might be able to add some of those in the future. It really depends. There's some difficulties we have with the current access to those protocols. But currently we do have the ability to access the vertex points, the corner points of mesh of these solid objects. So when you click on this corner, it now checks to find that point on this object, and now this point has been stored as the rotation point. This will always be independent of this 0, center, 1 scheme. You don't have to worry about that. This is only really used for the center of pivot picked item, picked element. So for this now, we have this point selected. So now if I do a pitch up, it's now rotating along that point. And as you can see, it does that in every possible view. I can do a multitude of things. You can see it's pivoting around that one point that I've selected. And you could select a different point too. If I wanted to select this pivot point, and I wanted it to pivot from this corner, the element that is currently selected is still that same element, but it's using the pivot point on this element, and I can do those rotations again, and now it'll move in a much more different fashion around that point. This is also the same for pivot element. We can set the pivot element, and we can set the, or actually that number here wasn't about that part, it was the pivot element. which happened to be that, but the center of picked pivot element. So now this is the pivot element as shown here. Now we can use these numbers and letters again to pick the point on that duct to rotate about and do the same thing. So that's different ways you can select different points on the duct or element that you're rotating. Okay, so let's say we've set it to an angle of 45 and we have an element here that we want to select as our rotated object. We've turned off auto set pivot on single select, so that when we select this element it doesn't become the pivot element. It's not necessary for us to do that really in this case, but we're going to go by pivot point instead of element. Remember that you need to have it in selected point or else it will not rotate by this and it will rotate by a center point of the selected element. So we'll set it to pivot point. We'll select the element and we'll say it's up against a wall up to here, but we want to rotate this so that this panel is aligned with the wall. So we'll set this pivot point here because this corner point on the model exists and we can reference it. And so now that's the pivot point for this element. Now we rotate it, rotate it 45 degrees, 90 degrees on this point. So it stayed in the same spot, but rotated it now up against the wall like we wanted it to be. And if we want to move it, we can move it a bit. Let's say it's too close to the wall up top. We set it to move. We just push it down some. We push it maybe a bit back or a bit forward. However we want to do. Maybe it's too high, too low. Do whatever changes you want to do. If we want to go up against a different wall or something, we're going to need to rotate it back. You can do whatever you want with it. You've got all this versatility to rotate this object because of this tool. So there's one of the big use cases for this program, is that you can use this to rotate different elements in any fashion that you want throughout your project. So as we were showing before, you can pretty much move just about anything in this program, or with this program. So you could even move the floor if you were inclined to. You really shouldn't, because there's a lot of things that could go wrong if you do that, but you could do it, because a lot of things get mapped to the floor, connected to the floor, but it is able to do it. But there are some things that you would probably want to be careful with moving. For instance, walls and detail lines. It does work with detail lines and walls. You can freely select them to your heart's content and use them with the same things as everywhere else. You could move it, let's say, to the right or to the left, and that will be accurate. The issue is, once you do a rotation, there are some situations that won't be so correct. So for this line, if we do a rotation to the left, let's say, so it's pitched down, you'll see that the line has gotten longer and has stayed connected to this other element. This is okay, but not perfect, because the issue is that this line has now positioned itself differently, so its center location's incorrect. It has lengthened itself to stay connected, so now it's maintaining length now that it's been moved back, so it's really not good. You could continually move back and forth and end up with a completely different line at the end, sadly. This is unfortunately true for walls as well. And there is also the potential issue where an element might, let's say if I disconnect this, might be disconnected from another element, but through movement, so let's say we move it to the left and back, it will attempt to join the element that it's moved to, which is not good for it, and it can happen with walls and detail lines when rotating, that they might bump into another one of their type and will attempt to link to them and possibly make themselves longer, shorter, or become merged and then have errors when you unmerge them by accident. So you can use this tool with those things. You just have to be very careful that you don't bump into something else, because it will potentially give you an issue. Now, if this line is just on its own out here in space, and we do some rotations to it, perfect. It runs just fine. There's no issues. It's completely accurate. Perfectly fine. Same for walls. You just have to be very careful that you don't bump into a line or a wall that it will attempt to connect to. So use at your own risk, but if you have a controlled environment, you should be fine. So let's say we have a bit of a different situation. So here we have a section view. Now, as we warned, section views are not the greatest when it comes to location due to them using bounding boxes. There are different situations where it can be more or less accurate, but currently, in this view, you would use a bounding box, and it would use this view for that bounding box. So you would want to be careful with how you deal with this situation. So let's say we select this. It will mention that it's a bounding box. At the end of your selection, it will give you a pop-up that says the bounding box items were found or group items were found. Would you like to keep them? Or rather, would you like to remove them? Because we want to remove them usually, but it's up to you if you want to keep them, because they can be relatively accurate, just not completely accurate. And it will ask if you want to remove them. You can say no. Okay, so we've chosen to keep that element. So now, as you can see, it's selected. It's the pivot element, and we can pitch it up, pitch it down, however we want to do, rotate it, and that's fine. It works just fine for rotations. And as we said before, it works fine for movement all the time. It's just that your inaccuracies can start becoming a thing when you do rotations. And it's using this view to maintain this information about it. Now, you can do things like lock active view, which will lock it to this view, which, as you can see here, typical room, test B, and the direction for the view is locked. So it's basically locking it to this view for referencing information, and also to this view direction for referencing rotations and stuff. So it could go to this view, and due to it being locked to these things, do the exact same thing we were just doing, and you can see the view will rotate according to that change. Now, you could also do something along the lines of this. Let's say we want to show the crop region. This crop region is the section view, so we could even do something like this. Let's say we clear the active lock, and it will set your view direction to custom. If you ever set your view direction with lock view direction, it will be a custom direction. Once again, use at your risk, because we have the pre-baked in directions you could use, or you should use the active view you have currently. But if you set it to custom through locking your view direction to the current view, you'll want to keep that in mind, because you might move something later and have an issue with that. So generally we tried not to use these too much because they have potential risks. And you will know if you're using a pre-select because it will say. Let's go ahead and clear the active view and direction, though, because active view is being used for referencing the bounding box there. And in this case, we have a new view, and we can see the bounding box again, so we can use it here instead. So we can select that item, complain about it again as it did before. We'll accept it, and then we will go ahead and select it. Now, we don't want to do pitch up because that will rotate it this way, which would be very bad. We will want to instead use yaw, which will rotate it left and right like we want. So we'll do the same thing here for the left. Actually, that's not the same direction as it was up top. You have to remember directions and stuff on these. But as you can see, it does the same as it was before because we selected the bounding box, or the crop of the view instead. So you can use it there as well. So if you have a view that's in a location and you want to get a really good view of a specific element or some object, you can set it next to it, rotate it a few times to wherever you want it to be, and you can have it move in and out, so get away from or towards the object you're looking for. If you want to like add or zoom in on anything like that. So there's a lot of possibilities, even if you wanted to like up floors or just go to the left or right. Those options are available to you. So it's really useful for moving around a view in just general space. It can also be used in sheets, So something like, let's see if we can grab a sheet here. So here's just a basic sheet. Let's just go to it. You can do things like select an element here. This is a view, so it could be less accurate, but it's fine for movements. Once again, rotations, be careful. So we can move it, and we can move it on the paper by 10 inches, or 10 millimeters, or whatever we want to do. No problem. Just be careful if you do a rotation on it, because it may not work. Now, as we had mentioned before, it will warn you about selecting an item like a bounding box or a group element to mention it is in that selection set. If you want to automatically say, no, you don't want to keep that element in the selection, what you can do is set things like auto-remove selected using groups, auto-remove selected using bounding boxes. So now if I select single item and I select this element, because it's a bounding box one, it'll automatically be removed. It won't send a message, but I will end up with basically nothing selected. See, nothing is selected because that element was removed. Okay, so far we've covered most of the things that we have to deal with. There are other situations, such as a segment of pipe, let's say here. So we've got a little example of, let's say, a bunch of pipes and systems connected to each other. So let's say we select this element, and we set the pivot element to this. When we do a rotation, we would be pivoting this element around that element. And you can see the pivot element is that element. The moving elements that we have selected that are going to move is this element. So you can use that for quick reference if you need to remind yourself what elements you're clicked on to. I'm sorry, that was a lot of view. Or no, that was on view. But you would use pivot element to see the pivot element, that was that one, moving element to see the elements that you are moving. And you can do something like this, and then pitch it, and now it will move that out of place. Now you'll notice it moved just this element because I told it to do just that element. And that caused an issue here, because we're rotating this instead of the entire pipe system, which might be what we want to do, because you can't rotate just that pipe. So what you can do is you can have it add connected elements during rotation. You want to be careful with this because it's expansive and it could cause some issues if you're not careful. But we could have it rotate again, and now you'll see it's rotated the entire system. But remember, it is rotating from this as a pivot element, so it could cause some distinct changes, so you might not want to do this in this fashion. The best way to do it might be to have a pivot element somewhere out in the field. I mean, it might be fun, because the pivot point is, continually moving at the same rate and direction, but if you want to, you could possibly use a different landmark. But in our case, we're just going to worry about using this point. We'll be fine with it like that, and we'll have it move everything that's connected to it. And we could rotate the entire system forward or backwards. We can even have it do crazy rotations, like rolling forward or yawing or something like that. One last item we hadn't gotten to mention just yet is the lock moved items to MEP. This only really applies to things that you select, but if you select items in a big swath, like say, let's say we select, in fact we can do it right now, let's do a group items, and we'll select all of this pipe, and we'll select a random few grid views, and grid lines and stuff like that. So now those grid lines will be part of the selection. If we select this, well, it's going to sift through this stuff, but these grid lines happen to be things that can be rotated if we really wanted to, and that would be an issue here. So we want to lock moved items to MEP. If we do something like this, you should really select things that you know you're okay with moving. Do not select grid lines. But if you want to do a mass selection and you don't want to go through the process of removing the grid lines from it, you could do something like this, where you can move only the MEP items. And so when I do a pitch up. In fact, let's do this as well because I want to move all of this and not have it explode. And we'll do this, and it will only move this element and put it back. And if we didn't have that selected, it would move everything. And as you can see, these grid lines are now going that way. Do not do that. That would be bad. But this MEP this lock only moved items to MEP is a bit rough, so it may not be everything you have in mind. So be careful. But it should select things like pipes, ducts, conduits, conduit trays, and all that stuff. And it will also deal with things like valves and fire dampers and stuff like that. So it should move them, but you should be careful not to get too dependent on it. It may not catch all. So with that, I think that this program is very useful. It's useful for moving elements in normal views, moving elements in 3D views, some places where you may not have an elevation view available to you, and you don't want to go sifting around to find an elevation view just so you can rotate a duct like 45 degrees upward. Instead of doing that, you can just select the duct and rotate it 45 degrees while facing north. It's something that will alleviate a lot of process with switching back and forth when doing small modifications, or if you wanted to lift something into the roof but you're on a 3D view and you don't want to find the plan view associated to that element but it's actively in front of you, you can select it and lift it up. And if you have any other elements that you specifically want to move but you don't have like easy controls for rotating them for whatever reason or moving them, we suggest using our program to do that and help you to make your process easier in your company. So with that, we hope you buy our program, check it out, enjoy it, and hopefully it's of good use to you and your company. And if not, feel free to check out any of our other programs. And if none of our programs currently meet your interests, we are still making other programs, so feel free to keep an eye out. We might come up with something else that you enjoy or want to use.